Stanley George Reynolds, Order of Canada. His great success as a collector of vintage vehicles, machines, and aircraft has resulted in his donating much of his collection to the province of Alberta and the Reynolds Alberta Museum, including the largest donation of vintage aircraft by an individual in Canadian history. The impact of his philanthropy is limitless and will benefit Canadians and their knowledge of aviation history for generations to come. Stan Reynolds was born to Gwendolyn and Ted Reynolds in Wetaskiwin, Alberta, on May 18, 1923. He developed his interest in cars at a very young age. His father was a pilot who had built a monoplane in the early 1920s. While in high school, Stan Reynolds worked at his father's garage after school, learning about cars and machines. He also learned about airplanes and collecting from his father, who kept his first car, a 1909 Oldsmobile, his whole life. These would become his lifelong passions.
Well, my father was mechanically minded, and he was a fairly clever man, and he could do a number of things that the average person couldn't do. During his lifetime, he would kind of collect certain things that he thought should be saved. He bought himself a 1904 Oldsmobile in 1910, and he still had that car when he died in 1974. Well, I guess I inherited some of his principles in regard to collecting, because when I was capable of starting to collect, I started to collect as well.
Reynolds' fascination with airplanes prompted him to join the RCAF in 1942. He trained as a pilot and was posted to 410 Night Fighter Squadron, flying Beaufighters and Mosquitoes on patrol over the North Sea.
At that time, 410 Squadron was on their duty was the defense of Britain, and we were stationed at Zeals in Sussex.
After the war, Reynolds returned to Wetaskiwin and built a 3-car garage with his savings. He started his first business venture, selling used cars, which he repaired and painted himself, and he studied for his auto mechanic and welder's licenses in 1946. He was 23 years old. Reynolds' used car business grew rapidly. His motto was, "Stan takes anything in trade."
You get the best deal at Stan Reynolds Auto Sales, the very best deal at Stan Reynolds Auto Sales. His trade-in price was the best price anywhere. Of course, there was more to it than that, and also a better tune.
From 1948 to 1956, Reynolds was Alberta's top auto dealer, operating 13 car lots. Wetaskiwin became known as a major automotive sales center. In 1953, he opened a new, spacious auto sales building on Highway 2 on the west side of the city, which is now known as the Auto Mile. In 1954, he offered the first lifetime warranty on cars in Canada. Reynolds expanded his operations to include sales of new and used cars, trucks, farm machinery, industrial equipment, house trailers, and airplanes. Reynolds is a perfectionist. Everything he did seemed to turn out exceptionally well. As his business grew, he was able to pursue his interest in antique cars. His first, a 1911 Overland touring car, was acquired as a trade-in, which he decided to restore and keep. He saw that Alberta was losing an important part of its heritage when people discarded their old items in favor of new. In 1948, he began collecting, preserving, and restoring antique cars in earnest, and in 1954 he expanded these interests to collecting antique tractors, steam engines, machinery, and aircraft. Most of these appeared to be nothing more than junk, but he saw the possibility of restoring their beauty. Reynolds never lost his passion for flying. In 1950, he received his pilot's license with float and night endorsements and bought a Cessna 170. Needing a proper airstrip, he built the Wetaskiwin Airport in 1952 on his land west of his auto sales building. At the official opening, he flew his 1940 Tiger Moth, putting on a display of aerobatics for the crowd of 7,000. He kept the airstrip licensed and maintained until he transferred ownership to the city and the county of Wetaskiwin in 1970. Stan Reynolds' interests are wide-ranging, and his enthusiasm for exploring new ventures knew no bounds. In 1953, he incorporated Air Spray Limited for application of fertilizers and pesticides using 2 Stearman biplanes. That same year, he formed Central Aviation Limited, which ran a flying school and a training program for air cadets. He is an avid sportsman. Whenever he could spare the time, he would fly into remote areas to hunt and fish. He enjoyed car racing, and in 1947 he won the Canadian Model T Ford Racing Championship in Calgary in a 1916 Ford that he had rebuilt. Through advertisements in the early 1950s, Reynolds was known across North America for his extensive collecting activities. People would contact him to tell him where old, unused items were abandoned. He would purchase these items and restore them to their original condition. Often he used his airplanes to fly over rural areas, and when he found something interesting, he would land and make an offer to the owner. The 1940 Tiger Moth is a good example of this process. On another of his forays, he located a derelict 1942 Hawker Hurricane, which he acquired and restored to airworthy condition. This rare multi-million-dollar aircraft, now on display, conveys an important story about Canadian military history.
One of my favorite items is the Hawker Hurricane. It was the Hawker Hurricane shot down more enemy aircraft in the Battle of Britain than any other Allied plane.
By 1955, Stan Reynolds had built his own museum, the Pioneer Museum, to share with the public some of the extraordinary items he had collected. A few years later, he changed the name to the Reynolds Museum, and by that time, he had amassed almost unimaginable numbers. 2,000 cars, 1,100 tractors, 500 trucks, 200 steam engines, 300 threshing machines, 800 stationary engines, and 125 aircraft, as well as military artifacts, Indian artifacts, and toys.
This year, my mother was working for GWG in Edmonton, and she bought me this mechanical set and gave it to me for Christmas.
Reynolds kept meticulous records of his collection, detailing everything he knew about each item. He knew that his collection represented an important part of Alberta's social history, as well as the technological progression of the machines that helped develop the province. Many of these articles would not exist today if he had not collected and preserved them.
In the 1940s, the Saskatchewan Museum had started collecting antique steam engines and tractors and cars, and there was some good tractors, good rare early tractors from Alberta, and cars that went to Saskatchewan. There was a Canadian tractor built in Medicine Hat that was still in Castor, and the owner told me that the Saskatchewan Museum wanted that. I thought, well, I got to start saving some of these units.
In the early 1970s, Reynolds envisioned a larger public museum for Wetaskiwin. In 1974, he offered his collection to the province of Alberta. Experts selected over 850 important artifacts that would become the foundation of a new facility to be operated by the government of Alberta to house, display, and interpret these artifacts. Plans called for several theme areas: transportation, agriculture, and industry. In 1981, he signed the agreement that formalized the first substantial donation. He has absorbed the cost of restoring many machines for the Reynolds Alberta Museum and supplies parts free of charge to assist in the restoration of the artifacts. The new museum was opened in 1992 and was named the Reynolds Alberta Museum in honor of the Reynolds family. Reynolds has given additional gifts over the years, such as his extensive library of original early catalogs, manuals, books, and magazines. In 1999, he made one of his most significant donations, 66 historic aircraft. This was the single largest private donation of vintage aircraft to a public institution in Canadian history, and he has continued to add to this collection, which now totals 88 aircraft, second in size only to the Canadian Aviation Museum in Ottawa. Reynolds has said that his interest in collecting was not for investment, but to ensure that future generations would have the opportunity to understand and appreciate how the development of our country, and Alberta in particular, was impacted by early machines. His gift to the province ensured that these rare artifacts and the amazing stories they represent will be maintained for years to come. And Stan Reynolds' acts of generosity go far beyond his donations to the province of Alberta. When Canada's Aviation Hall of Fame was moved from Edmonton to the new Reynolds Alberta Museum in Wetaskiwin in 1992, he supplied the trucks and staff needed for the move. He also loaned several of his personal vintage aircraft to supplement the exhibits in the new aviation hangar. Reynolds has been recognized for his many accomplishments, service to his community, and contributions to the citizens of Alberta and Canada. He is proud to have been awarded the Order of Canada and the Alberta Order of Excellence. Reynolds maintains his affiliation with many organizations, including the RCAF, the Legion, Quarter Century Club, and the Guinea Pig Club, started by Dr. Tilley. Stan Reynolds married Holly Algert, and they raised 3 daughters, Susan, Judith, and Diane. He still goes to work every day, continuing to participate actively in the Reynolds Alberta Museum's advisory board and in building and developing its collections. He says he has too much to do and doesn't think he will ever retire. A quiet and unassuming man, Stan Reynolds' actions speak volumes, and he has created an unparalleled record in the areas of curatorship, historical research, restoration and conservation, public education, and philanthropy.
Well, this is more or less like a lifetime's work. And if I didn't preserve them, these items would be gone.
Stanley George Reynolds was inducted as a member of Canada's Aviation Hall of Fame at ceremonies held in Wetaskiwin on May 30th, 2009.